It was supposed to be a simple errand, the kind you barely think about, the kind that fits quietly into the middle of an ordinary afternoon, because earlier that day my doctor had called in a prescription after a routine appointment and told me it would be ready later. So after finishing some work at home, I drove over to the grocery store pharmacy, a few miles away, expecting the usual quick stop where you walk in, pick up a small white paper bag, pay for it, and head back out. But as soon as I stepped up to the pharmacy counter and gave the technician my name, she looked at the computer screen and said it was still being filled and it would probably take about 20 minutes, which sounded reasonable enough, so I thanked her, turned around, and took a seat in the small waiting area that ran along the wall just a few feet from the counter. The pharmacy waiting area itself was nothing special, just for hard plastic chairs bolted together in a row with a small side table, covered in outdated health magazines and a poster on the wall about flu shots, and when I first sat down, there were already a few people waiting there as well, including an older man flipping through a newspaper, a middle-aged woman quietly scrolling through her phone, and a teenager leaning against the wall with headphones in, while behind the counter the pharmacist and the technicians moved quickly between ringing up customers, answering phones, and filling bottles, creating that familiar low hum of activity that pharmacies always seem to have. So I pulled out my phone and started responding to emails while I waited, because I work remotely and it's pretty normal for me to turn little waiting periods into short work sessions. About 15 minutes passed without much happening other than customers coming and going, and eventually the older man's name was called, so he folded his newspaper, stood up slowly, and walked to the counter to collect his medication, while the woman next to me followed a few minutes later when the technician called her name, leaving just me and the teenager in the waiting area. And although I noticed the time had stretched slightly beyond the original estimate, the pharmacy still looked busy enough that I didn't question it, since anyone who has waited for a prescription knows that 20 minutes can easily turn into 40 depending on insurance issues, phone calls, or doctors needing clarification on something. Another 10 minutes slipped by, and the teenager eventually pushed himself off the wall and walked away toward the front of the store, leaving me as the only person sitting in the waiting area. But I barely noticed because I was focused on my phone and occasionally glancing up toward the counter to see if the technicians were calling any names, while customers continued stepping up to pick up their prescriptions and leaving just as quickly. And for the most part, everything felt completely normal. The kind of quiet routine moment that happens thousands of times a day in pharmacies all over the country. Then the woman walked in, the kind of person who somehow manages to draw attention the moment they enter a room, because she had a stiff posture, short blonde hair styled carefully in place, oversized sunglasses pushed up on top of her head even though we were indoors, and a large purse tucked tightly under her arm as if she were guarding it from invisible thieves. And she marched straight to the counter with a determined expression, spoke briefly with the pharmacist, paid for her prescription, and then turned to leave. But halfway toward the exit, she suddenly slowed down and looked over at me sitting in the waiting area. At first I thought she was just glancing around the room the way people do when they're about to leave a store, but instead she stopped completely and looked again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were trying to place where she knew me from, and when our eyes met I gave a polite nod and went back to my phone, assuming that was the end of the interaction. But a few seconds later, I heard the sharp sound of someone clearing their throat, followed by a voice saying "excuse me," which made me look up again to see that she had walked over and was now standing a few feet away from me with an expression that suggested she had already decided something about me that I didn't yet understand. She asked me how long I had been sitting there, which struck me as an odd question coming from a complete stranger, but I answered honestly and said maybe 30 or 40 minutes, because my prescription was still being filled. And instead of simply nodding and moving on, she frowned deeply as though I had just confessed to something suspicious, glancing at the empty chairs beside me and then back in my face before saying that pharmacies don't usually take that long. And although I shrugged and explained that sometimes they do when they're busy, she didn't seem satisfied with that explanation and instead kept staring at me with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for someone doing something clearly wrong. Then she accused me of sitting there watching people pick up their prescriptions, which caught me so off guard that I actually laughed because the idea seemed so ridiculous. And I held up my phone to show that I had simply been answering the mails while I waited, but she shook her head firmly and insisted that wasn't what it looked like to her, claiming that I had been observing customers the entire time and that it made her uncomfortable, which was the moment I realized this wasn't just a brief misunderstanding, but the beginning of something far more unnecessary and exhausting. I tried to stay calm and told her that the pharmacy staff knew I was waiting there because I had checked in earlier. But instead of accepting that, she crossed her arms and said she thought I needed to leave because I had been there too long and it seemed suspicious. And at that point, the absurdity of the situation really started to sink in because I was literally sitting in the designated waiting area of a pharmacy, waiting for my medication like any normal customer would do. Yet somehow the stranger had decided that my presence alone was a problem that required her personal intervention. When I politely told her I wasn't going anywhere because I was still waiting for my prescription, she grew more agitated and said that people like me shouldn't just sit around watching others pick up medication, which I again denied because I hadn't been watching anyone at all. But she seemed convinced that her interpretation of the situation was the only possible explanation, and after a tense moment of silence, she pulled out her phone and announced that she was calling the police because she felt unsafe with me sitting there. A statement so dramatic that for a second I thought she must be joking. Unfortunately, she was not joking because she actually dialed and began speaking loudly enough for the entire pharmacy to hear, telling the dispatcher that there was a man sitting in the pharmacy waiting area watching customers for nearly an hour and that it was making her uncomfortable, which finally caught the attention of the pharmacist, who leaned over the counter and asked what was going on. And when the woman repeated her accusation, the pharmacist calmly explained that I had checked in earlier and was simply waiting for my prescription to be finished. But the woman replied that she had already called the police and they were on their way. About 10 minutes later, two police officers walked through the sliding doors of the grocery store and approached the pharmacy area. And the woman immediately pointed at me as if she had just caught a criminal red-handed, telling them I had been sitting there watching customers for an hour. But when one of the officers asked me what was happening, I simply explained that I was waiting for a prescription that was still being filled, which the pharmacist confirmed without hesitation, explaining that the pharmacy had been busy and the medication had just finished processing. The officers exchanged a brief glance that clearly communicated they understood exactly what kind of situation they had walked into. And one of them gently explained to the woman that people waiting in pharmacy waiting areas for prescriptions is completely normal behavior. But she insisted that it had taken too long and that she still felt it was suspicious, which prompted the pharmacist to lift a small white bag with my name on it and announced that my prescription was finally ready, effectively ending the entire situation in the most anticlimactic way possible. I walked up to the counter, signed for the medication, thanked the pharmacy staff for their patience, and then asked the officer if I was free to go, which he confirmed with a small smile, before turning back to the woman and suggesting that next time she should allow store staff to handle concerns before calling emergency services. And as I walked out toward the parking lot, I couldn't help laughing at how an ordinary afternoon errand had somehow turned into a police response simply because someone decided that sitting quietly in a pharmacy waiting area for too long was suspicious behavior.